On your screen right now is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, 40 years in the U.S. military, and he came into office just 3 weeks after the September 11th attacks. He has written a book about being on the front lines of national security called Eyes on the Horizon, which is widely available in bookstores around the country. General, I want to peg off of the conversation we just had with Congresswoman Woolsey to highlight a paragraph in your book where you talk about not being clear on the objectives of the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan and how difficult it was to know what success was. Will you talk about that in the light of the fact that we seem to be changing strategies, particularly in Afghanistan right now?
Well, what I was trying to do is contrast, previous conflicts. World War II, we sort of knew what victory was. You could follow the lines on the map, and as we advanced through Europe, towards Berlin, or as we advanced towards the main islands in Japan, you could track progress, and we knew had a better sense of what victory was going to be. It was going to be surrender of the enemy. When you're fighting an insurgency, those distinctions aren't as clear, and so it's difficult to describe what victory is. And I'd say in a military sense, there's not going to be victory. There's going to be victory in a sense that Iraq becomes a stable country, Afghanistan becomes a stable country, things that are harder, I think, for people to understand, that take more time, and that are just harder to describe.
Toward the close of the book, when you talk about the future, you write, "My view has been that since 9/11, we haven't developed a national strategy adequate for dealing with global insurgency. For the most part, we look at the threat more narrowly. That is, we view operations tactically and do not place them in the larger strategic context that would lead to an appropriate strategy."
Right. We would meet often at the National Security Council on Afghanistan or Iraq. Less frequently, of course, many times less frequently, about, okay, the broader issue of violent extremism and how we deal with it, and do we have a strategy to deal with it?
And thinking of these as theaters in a larger war?
Yes, they're just part of a larger, I would argue, part of a larger issue, which is violent extremism, which I dub a global insurgency. And you see it play out in Pakistan, you see it play out from time to time in India, in China, in Indonesia, in Thailand, many places, North Africa, many places, Mali, many places around the world where there is insurgent activity trying to delegitimize legitimate governments, and doing it through violence. So that's why violent extremism is the term I put on it instead of the war on terrorism.
Why is it that a more global and more strategic look hasn't been advanced?
It's a good question. There was a lot of effort as I was in my last year in office, as we were dealing with Iraq, we're dealing with Afghanistan. I think that's probably the reason. We had people dying, being badly injured in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and that tends to be where your focus is. But you have to take time. You have to step back, take the 30,000-foot view, and say, okay, are we dealing with violent extremism in the way we should? Are we overusing the military instrument of power and not using the diplomatic or the economic or the informational instrument of power in ways that would facilitate success here?
Was part of the reason at all due to the structure of the agencies tasked to this?
Well, yes, and I go into that in a little bit. And bear in mind, I served in the Clinton administration as assistant to the chairman and as vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then under Bush as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is not administration specific, but our government is not perfectly organized to bring all our elements of power to bear on a problem. And the one element of power that is well-resourced, that will do exactly what the President, the Commander-in-Chief, says to do, is the Department of Defense and our military. The other departments and agencies are not as well-resourced in terms of either money or manpower, and so less able to focus these instruments, some of which, diplomacy, of course, rest primarily with the State Department. So we are not organized. If somebody said, well, who's in charge of the global war on terrorism? Well, you can say, well, the President, but the President can't be in charge. He has to have somebody at probably cabinet rank that's in charge, and below him, it's really hard to put a finger on anybody that is responsible, has the authority, and then you can hold accountable. So, no, we're not perfectly organized. We haven't been for for a long time. The National Security Act of 1947 perfectly organized us for our recent experiences, which was in World War II. So in a sense, we're perfectly organized for those kind of conflicts, not the kind of security challenges we face here in the 21st century.
The General will be with us for a full hour, and there's so much that is still in the news today that we are interested in talking with him about. Many of these are issues that are touched upon in his book, and we welcome your comments and questions on national security and our military and policies that are in the process of being changed and debated right now in Washington. So here are the phone numbers: 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, and 202-628-0205 for Independents. General, I've got some callers already teed up, so I'm going to get to them, and then we'll come back to our conversation here. Let's begin with a call from Silver Spring. This is Jeremy, Republican line. Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning, ma'am and sir. I have two questions, and I'll take my answers off the air. First, I would like to say I spent 2 deployments overseas in Iraq after 9/11, and I truly respect what the guys are doing over there still. However, it seems as if one person's freedom fighter is another person's insurgent. And I only bring up that point because the American agenda appears to be democracy everywhere and at all costs. So my question is, when we were overseas, it always seems as though we're trying to force our way of life on somebody else. I want to know how you feel about that. And it would also appear as though the wars that we're currently in Iraq and Afghanistan, they really aren't set to win or lose, but rather to sustain. Just with regards to the military-industrial complex and the people that are profiting off of these wars, rather than
Thanks very much. His first question actually gets to the heart of a debate that you recount going on within the highest levels of the administration after 9/11.
Right, and there was debate about, how much of our democratic principles should we try to overlay on Iraq. And I think in the end, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, while there was certainly assistance in helping them shape their new constitutions, if people remember, both Iraq and Afghanistan have relatively new constitutions. They're both considered liberal constitutions, and they're their own work. The UN helped, certainly we helped, other countries helped them shape all that. But in the end, they were their own constitutions adopted by their people. I can remember specifically during Iraqi elections, to Jeremy's point here, when people would try to convince the president, we've got to influence the outcome of this election. Iran is trying to influence who's going to be elected inside Iraq. We've got to be trying to influence for certain individuals that we think will represent our views best. And the president said, listen, this is their country, this is their constitution, this is their democracy, we're not going to get involved in that. We've tried that in the past. It's never been terribly successful. The chips will fall where they may. And in fact, when we wound up with a government with Prime Minister Maliki as the head of it, he would not have been, I don't think, at that point, the first choice of the United States hierarchy, the government. But it turned out, he's actually turned out to be a pretty good prime minister. So I think you can go too far here. I think providing the opportunities for both Iraq and Afghanistan for their people to go to the polls at great risk, in both cases, to their own personal safety, and adopt their constitutions, elect their governments, however they want to, whatever form of government they want. I don't think we have tried too aggressively to overlay, other than democratic principles, on these countries. And by the way, Jeremy, I thank you for your service. Thank you.
With regard to Iraq, here's a paragraph I want to share with the audience in your book. At the time, I was personally much less convinced that removing Saddam Hussein's regime would be the key to the spread of peace and democracy in the Middle East. Some experts thought that a stable democratic government in the region would become the catalyst for similar positive change throughout the area. But the WMD issue was enough of a concern to me, and I felt the objective of removing Saddam from power would justify putting our men and women in harm's way if directed by the commander-in-chief. So then when the WMD issue turned out as it did, how do you square that thinking?